In the pages of Crimson Hearts, a cynical graduate student was about to shatter every romantic convention ever written. What started as academic research took a shocking turn when they came face to face with a world where fiction had become terrifyingly real. Caleb Harrison wasn't your typical literature scholar. Years he had spent his life dissecting formulaic romance novels. He's known for his scathing critiques of toxic love tropes, till he woke up trapped inside one as Adrian Blackthorne, destined to pine hopelessly for the heroine while she chose another. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first sensation was silk impossibly smooth against skin that felt both familiar and foreign. Caleb's eyes snapped open to find himself staring at an ornate ceiling painted with cherubs and roses, their golden frames catching the amber light of morning. This wasn't his cramped graduate student apartment with its water-stained ceiling and the neighbor's television bleeding through paper-thin walls. "This has to be a dream," he muttered, his voice carrying an accent that made him freeze. The words had emerged with the crisp pronunciation of Victorian England, not his usual Pacific Northwest drawl. His hand shot to his throat, fingers encountering the unfamiliar texture of a silk cravat. Panic flickered through him as he sat up, taking in the opulent bedroom that belonged in a period drama, not reality. Heavy burgundy drapes framed windows that looked out onto manicured gardens, their perfectly trimmed hedges forming intricate patterns. The furniture was all dark mahogany and gilt accents, a massive wardrobe that could house a small family. A writing desk adorned with silver inkwells and chairs upholstered in fabric that probably cost more than his monthly stipend. This is impossible. The thought came with crystal clarity, accompanied by a surge of memories that weren't his own. Adrian Blackthorne, 28 years old, second son of Lord Edmund Blackthorne, educated at Oxford. Recently returned from a year of mourning after Eleanor's tragic death in a carriage accident. No. Caleb scrambled from the bed, his bare feet hitting a Persian rug that felt real beneath his toes. Too real. Everything was too detailed, too vivid for a dream. The scent of lavender and old wood filled his nostrils, and when he caught sight of himself in the mirror across the room, he nearly stumbled. The face looking back at him was handsome in that brooding, tortured way that romance novels adored: sharp cheekbones, dark hair that looked artfully tousled, even fresh from sleep, and eyes the color of storm clouds. It was Adrian Blackthorne's face, exactly as Caleb had imagined him while reading Crimson Hearts for his thesis on formulaic fiction. "This is completely insane," he whispered, then immediately regretted speaking aloud. The voice was Adrian's, cultured, slightly deeper than his own, carrying an inherent authority that came from generations of privilege. A soft knock at the door made his heart lurch. "Master Adrian, shall I bring your morning tea?" The voice belonged to Thomas, Adrian's loyal valet. Caleb knew this with the same certainty. He knew his own name except right now. He wasn't entirely sure what his own name was. The knowledge sat in his mind like two different radio stations broadcasting simultaneously. Sometimes his own memories taking precedence, sometimes Adrian's eyes. "Thomas, come in." The words came automatically, Adrian's ingrained courtesy, overriding Caleb's modern sensibilities. The door opened to reveal a middle-aged man with graying hair and the impeccably pressed uniform of a gentleman's gentleman. He carried a silver tray laden with fine china and what smelled like Earl Grey. His movements were precise, practiced, and when he set the tray on the bedside table, his eyes held the familiar warmth of someone who had served the family for decades. "Shall I lay out your riding clothes, sir? Your father mentioned he wished to speak with you about the Rosewood invitation before you made your decision." The Rosewood invitation? Caleb's stomach dropped as the implications crashed over him. In Crimson Hearts, the Rosewood Ball was where Adrian first met Lady Evangeline, where he was supposed to fall instantly and hopelessly in love with her, setting up the tragic love triangle that formed the novel's central conflict. It was the catalyst for everything Adrian's doomed pining. Evangeline's eventual choice of Duke William and Adrian's noble sacrifice that allowed true love to triumph. The invitation Caleb repeated slowly, his mind racing. "When is the ball?" "This Saturday evening, sir. Days hence." Thomas busied himself selecting clothes from the wardrobe, apparently interpreting Caleb's confusion as morning grogginess. "Your father is quite pleased that Lord Rosewood extended the invitation. He believes it's time you re-entered society. Properly, given that your mourning period for Miss Eleanor has concluded." Eleanor. The name sent a wave of grief through him that felt foreign yet genuine. Adrian's love for his deceased fiancée. A wound that had shaped every aspect of his character in the novel. Caleb could feel the emotions like an undertow threatening to pull him under if he wasn't careful. He moved to the writing desk, his hands shaking slightly as he picked up various objects: a leather-bound journal, a silver letter opener, a miniature portrait of a young woman with gentle eyes and golden hair. Eleanor Whitmore, dead at 22, leaving Adrian a broken man who could never fully love again. Except Caleb wasn't broken. He was terrified, confused, and increasingly convinced he was losing his mind. But he wasn't Adrian Blackthorne. Where was Caleb Harrison, 26 years old, working on his graduate thesis about the problematic tropes in Victorian romance novels? He had spent months analyzing Crimson Hearts, dissecting its predictable plot points and two-dimensional characters, writing scathing critiques of its portrayal of love as suffering and its glorification of emotional unavailability. "Sir," Thomas's voice held a note of concern. "Are you quite well? You seem different this morning." Different. If only Thomas knew. Caleb forced himself to look up, to meet the valet's worried gaze. "I'm fine, Thomas. Just thinking about the invitation." "Of course, sir. It is rather significant. Lord Rosewood's daughter is said to be the most beautiful young lady in the county. Perhaps it's time." Thomas trailed off diplomatically, but Caleb could hear the unspoken hope. Time to move on from Eleanor. Time to find love again. Time to follow the script. But that was exactly what Caleb could and wouldn't do. He had spent his academic career studying the damage these narratives did, the way they taught people that love meant suffering, that the best relationships were built on unattainable desire rather than genuine compatibility. The idea of playing out Adrian's role, of falling for Evangeline only to spend the entire story pining hopelessly while she chose someone else, made his skin crawl. "Thomas," he said carefully, "what if I decided not to attend?" The valet's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, concern, and something that looked almost like fear. "Not attend, sir. But your father has already sent word that you'll be there. The Lord Rosewood has specifically requested your presence." It would be quite the social slight to decline now. Of course it would be. In a novel where everything revolved around social propriety and predetermined romantic entanglements, declining the invitation that set the entire plot in motion would be unthinkable. But Caleb was thinking it. He was more than thinking it. He was planning it. "I see." He set down Eleanor's portrait, noting how the action seemed to send a pang through his chest that felt entirely too real. "Well, we have 3 days to consider it properly." Thomas nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "Indeed, sir. Shall I inform your father you'll join him for breakfast?" "Yes, please do." Caleb needed time to think, to plan, to figure out if there was any way out of this nightmare. But if he was truly trapped in Crimson Hearts, if this was somehow real and not the most vivid stress dream in academic history, then he had a choice to make. He could play Adrian's role, fall for Evangeline, suffer nobly for 300 pages, and watch her choose Duke William in the end. Or he could rewrite the story entirely. As Thomas left to arrange breakfast, Caleb moved to the window and looked out at the manicured gardens. Somewhere in this world, Lady Evangeline Rosewood was preparing for a ball where she was supposed to meet her future husband and the man who would pine for her from afar. Duke William was probably practicing his charming smile and witty conversation. But Adrian Blackthorne, or rather, Caleb Harrison wearing Adrian's face, had other plans. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like possibilities. 3 days until the ball. 3 days to decide whether to follow a script written by someone else or forge his own path through this strange literary prison. The choice, for perhaps the first time in Adrian Blackthorne's fictional life, was entirely his own. The morning, Sun had long since given way to candlelight by the time Caleb found himself standing at the edge of the Rosewood ballroom, watching his carefully laid plans unfold with the precision of a pocket watch. 3 days of preparation had led to this moment. 3 days of declining his father's attempts at conversation, of avoiding the pointed questions about his intentions regarding Lady Evangeline, and of steeling himself for what he was about to do. The ballroom glittered like something from a fairy tale. All crystal chandeliers and gold leaf, with enough flowers to supply a modest funeral. Ladies in pastel gowns swept across the polished marble floor, while gentlemen in pristine evening wear clustered around the edges, their conversations a carefully orchestrated symphony of social positioning and veiled ambition. And there, in the center of it all, stood Lady Evangeline Rosewood. Caleb's breath caught despite himself. The novel's description hadn't done her justice. Auburn curls that caught the light like spun copper, skin like porcelain, and eyes the color of spring violets. She wore a gown of pale blue silk that seemed to shimmer with each movement. And when she laughed at something her companion said, the sound carried across the room like silver bells. No wonder Adrian was supposed to fall for her instantly. The thought came unbidden, followed immediately by Adrian's memories trying to surface fragments of longing, of poetry written by moonlight, of dreams where Eleanor's face morphed into features he'd never seen, but somehow knew belonged to his destiny. Caleb shook his head, forcing himself to focus. He wasn't here to fall in love. He was here to observe, to understand, and most importantly, to stay as far away from the heroine as possible. Magnificent evening, isn't it? The voice belonged to Duke William Ashworth, and Caleb turned to find himself face to face with the novel's designated hero. Tall, golden-haired, with the kind of easy confidence that came from never having been denied anything. William embodied everything Caleb had criticized in his thesis about male romantic leads. His smile was practiced perfection, his posture speaking of riding horses and fencing masters, and his eyes held the calculating gleam of someone who knew exactly how charming he was. Indeed, Caleb replied carefully, noting how William's gaze kept drifting toward Evangeline. Right on schedule, the Duke was supposed to be completely smitten by now. Though in the original story, Adrian's presence would have created a delicious tension that kept Evangeline torn between two suitors. I don't believe we've been properly introduced, William continued, though something in his expression suggested he knew exactly who Caleb was. William Ashworth. And you must be the mysterious Adrian Blackthorne I've heard so much about. Mysterious, that was. Not how Adrian was supposed to be perceived at this point in the story. He should have been tragic, brooding, but approachable, nursing his grief in a way that made ladies want to comfort him. Instead, Caleb's deliberate withdrawal from society seemed to have created an entirely different reputation. I'm hardly mysterious, Caleb said, then immediately wondered if he should have used more formal language. The social protocols of 1800s England sat uneasily alongside his modern sensibilities, simply private. William's laugh was hearty and genuine, but his eyes remained sharp. Private? Yes. Though I must say, your absence from society has only made the ladies more curious about you. Lady Evangeline herself mentioned she was quite looking forward to making your acquaintance. There it was, the setup, the gentle push toward his predetermined romantic fate. In the original story, this would be the moment when Adrian's heart began to race, when destiny started its inexorable pull toward tragic love. Instead, Caleb felt only a cold dread settling in his stomach. Thoughtful of her? He managed, scanning the room for an escape route. The problem with balls was that they were designed to facilitate exactly the kind of social interaction he was trying to avoid. Every corner held another opportunity for scripted encounters, every dance a potential deviation from his carefully planned rebellion. She's quite remarkable, William continued, his voice taking on the dreamy quality of a man genuinely besotted, beautiful, accomplished, kind-hearted, the sort of woman who could make any man forget his troubles. Any man except me, Caleb thought grimly. He was about to excuse himself when he noticed something that made him freeze the candles nearest to him had begun to flicker in perfect unison, despite the absence of any breeze. As he watched, the flames seemed to lean toward him, as if straining to get his attention. Mr. Blackthorne? William's voice seemed to come from very far away. Are you quite well? The candles flared brighter for just a moment, and in that brief illumination, Caleb could have sworn he heard a whisper so faint it might have been his imagination, but unmistakably urgent. The dance. You must ask her to dance. The narrator. The realization hit him like cold water. The story was already trying to correct itself, to push him back onto the predetermined path. He could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on him, the invisible hand of narrative inevitability, trying to guide his steps toward Evangeline. I need some air, Caleb said abruptly, turning away from William's concerned expression. He pushed through the crowd, ignoring the curious glances and whispered speculations his hasty departure was sure to generate. The French doors leading to the garden beckoned like a lifeline. The cool night air was a relief after the stifling heat of the ballroom, but Caleb had barely taken 2 breaths when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned, expecting William or perhaps one of the other gentlemen come to check on his strange behavior. Instead, he found himself looking at a young woman he didn't recognize from the novel at all. She was perhaps 25, with dark hair pulled back in an unfashionably simple style and intelligent brown eyes that studied him with frank curiosity. Her gown was well made but not ostentatious, suggesting comfort rather than wealth, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never learned to apologize for taking up space. You look like a man fleeing from something, she observed, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. I can't imagine what could be frightening enough in a ballroom to send someone running into the gardens. Caleb stared at her, his mind racing. She wasn't supposed to be here, in all his careful analysis of Crimson Hearts. There had been no mention of a sharp-eyed young woman with an irreverent sense of humor. She was an anomaly, a character who didn't fit the story's carefully constructed world. Margaret Winters, she said, apparently interpreting his silence as a request for introduction. And before you ask, no, I'm not supposed to be here either. My aunt dragged me along as a companion, thinking the country air might cure my unfortunate tendency toward independent thought. Independent thought. The phrase sent a spark of hope through Caleb's chest. Here, finally, was someone who might understand what he was trying to do. Adrian Blackthorne, he replied, then found himself adding, and I'm beginning to think independent thought might be the most dangerous thing in the world. Margaret's smile was sharp and knowing. Only if you're in a world that prefers its stories already written. Tell me, Mr. Blackthorne, are you the sort of man who follows scripts, or do you prefer to write your own ending? Behind them, the music swelled as the next dance began, and Caleb could see through the windows as Duke William approached Lady Evangeline with his practiced bow. She curtsied gracefully, her eyes scanning the room as if looking for someone who wasn't there. The candles inside flickered again, more urgently this time, and for a moment the very air seemed to shimmer with frustrated energy. The story was trying to pull its pieces back into place, but one crucial element was missing. Caleb turned back to Margaret, whose eyebrows had risen as she noticed the strange behavior of the lights. I think, he said slowly, I'd like to try writing my own ending.
Although I suspect the story might have other ideas.
As if in response to his words, the ballroom doors burst open, and Lady Evangeline herself appeared on the terrace. Her violet eyes bright with curiosity and something that looked disturbingly like determination. Mr. Blackthorne, she said, her voice carrying the musical quality that had enchanted readers for generations. Been looking everywhere for you. The words I've been looking everywhere for you hung in the night air like a challenge thrown. Down between them, Caleb felt the weight of Evangeline's violet gaze and the expectant silence that followed, as if the entire universe had paused to see how he would respond to this pivotal moment. In the original story, this would be where Adrian stammered something appropriately romantic, where their eyes met and destiny clicked into place like a key turning in a lock. Instead, Caleb took a deliberate step backward, positioning Margaret slightly between himself and the approaching heroine. Lady Evangeline, he said with careful formality, offering the barest acceptable bow, I hope you're enjoying the evening. Something flickered across her perfect features, confusion, perhaps, or the first hint of wounded pride. She had clearly expected a different reception, and her smile faltered for just a moment before reasserting itself with renewed determination. "Indeed I am, though I confess I was disappointed not to see you on the dance floor. I had so hoped." She trailed off delicately, her meaning clear to anyone versed in the subtle language of Victorian courtship. Margaret cleared her throat softly. "Perhaps you haven't been properly introduced? I'm Margaret Winters, Lady Evangeline. Mr. Blackthorne and I were just discussing the fascinating behavior of candlelight in enclosed spaces." Evangeline's gaze shifted to Margaret with the kind of polite dismissal reserved for servants and spinster companions. "How? Illuminating? Mr. Blackthorne, might I have a word?" "Privately?" The request carried the gentle authority of someone accustomed to having her wishes granted immediately. But Caleb had spent 3 days preparing for exactly this moment, steeling himself against the pull of predetermined destiny. "I'm afraid I was just escorting Miss Winters back inside," he said smoothly. "Perhaps another time." The lie came easier than he'd expected, though he caught Margaret's sharp look of surprise. Evangeline's composure cracked visibly, her perfect smile becoming rigid. "Another time," she repeated, as if the words were foreign to her. "Yes, of course, how considerate of you." She turned and swept back into the ballroom. But not before Caleb caught the flash of something darker in her expression, a glimpse of the obsession that would later consume her character, arriving far earlier than it should have. "Well," Margaret said once they were alone again, "that was either very gallant or very foolish. Possibly both." "Probably both," Caleb agreed, watching through the windows as Evangeline rejoined the dancing with Duke William. Her movements seemed more mechanical now, her attention clearly elsewhere. Even from a distance, he could see her eyes searching the crowd. The next few days passed in a blur of increasingly strange occurrences. Caleb had returned to Blackthorne Manor hoping to resume some semblance of normal life, but the story had other plans. It started with small things. Letters that rewrote themselves when he wasn't looking, invitations to social events he'd never heard of, correspondence from friends who spoke of conversations that had never happened. His valet Thomas began delivering messages that felt scripted. His usual warmth, replaced by dialogue that sounded like it had been lifted directly from the pages of a romance novel. "Master Adrian," Thomas would say, with unnatural formality, "might I suggest you pay a call on the Rosewood estate? The morning air would do you good, and I'm certain Lady Evangeline would welcome the visit." The dreams were worse. Caleb found himself in conversations with a voice that seemed to emanate from the very walls of his consciousness. The narrator, desperate and increasingly frustrated, pleaded with him to return to his proper role. "You're destroying everything," the voice whispered as he tossed restlessly in Adrian's ornate bed. "The story cannot function without its pieces in place. She needs to fall for the Duke. You need to love her from afar. This is how it must be. This is how you wrote it to be." Caleb muttered into his pillow. "That doesn't make it right, right? Wrong? These concepts have no meaning in fiction, whereas only the story as it was meant to unfold." But even as the narrator spoke, cracks appeared in its certainty. The story world itself began to rebel against the broken narrative, reality. Bending in increasingly obvious ways, servants repeated conversations verbatim, sometimes within minutes of each other. Weather patterns shifted dramatically, sunshine to storm and back again, if reflecting some cosmic emotional turmoil. On the third morning after the ball, Caleb discovered something that made his blood run cold. Adrian's diary, which he'd been using to record his thoughts and observations, contained entries he had never written. "My heart grows heavy with each passing day," one entry read in handwriting that was unmistakably his own. "Lady Evangeline haunts my thoughts, though I know I can never be worthy of her affections. If only Eleanor had not died, perhaps I might have learned to love again. But fate has marked me for tragedy, and I must content myself with admiring the lady from afar." Caleb's hand shook as he read the words. The story was literally writing itself around him, trying to force him back into character through the most intimate violation possible, stealing his own thoughts and replacing them with Adrian's predetermined emotions. He was still staring at the diary when Thomas knocked and entered without waiting for permission, another deviation from the valet's usual impeccable manners. "Master Adrian," Thomas announced with mechanical precision. Lady Evangeline Rosewood has come to call. Through the window, Caleb could see an elegant carriage in the courtyard, its occupant already disembarking with the determined stride of someone who had given up on subtle approaches. Evangeline wore a riding habit of deep green that complemented her auburn hair, and her expression carried a focus that bordered on predatory. "Tell her I'm indisposed," Caleb said quickly. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Thomas blinked, his usual deference flickering like a candle in the wind. "But sir, it would be most improper to tell her I'm indisposed," Caleb repeated, more firmly this time. For a moment Thomas looked genuinely confused, as if the script running in his head had encountered an error it couldn't process. Then his expression cleared, returning to its normal warmth. "Of course, sir, though I must say the young lady seems quite determined. She specifically mentioned that she wouldn't be leaving until she'd spoken with you personally." And indeed, when Caleb peered out the window again, he could see Evangeline directing her driver to wait, her posture suggesting she had all the time in the world. The standoff lasted nearly 2 hours. Evangeline maintained her vigil in the courtyard, while Caleb remained barricaded in his study, watching her through the curtains like a prisoner in his own home. She walked the grounds with increasing agitation, her perfect composure cracking bit by bit as time passed without the expected romantic encounter. Finally, she did something that shocked even Caleb in its boldness. She approached the front door and knocked herself, abandoning all pretense of proper Victorian etiquette. "Mr. Blackthorne," her voice carried clearly through the heavy wood. "I know you're in there. We need to speak." The desperation in her tone was unmistakable, and it frightened him more than any supernatural manifestation. This wasn't the gentle, patient Evangeline of the original story. This was someone whose very identity was being challenged by his refusal to play his role. "Sir." Thomas appeared at his elbow, looking genuinely distressed. "Perhaps it would be kinder to simply know." Caleb stepped away from the window, his mind made up. "Send word that I've gone to London, on urgent business." Thomas's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, concern, and something that looked almost like fear. "But sir, your father will let him expect whatever he likes. I'm leaving for London within the hour." It was a desperate move, but Caleb could see no other choice. The story was closing in around him, using every tool at its disposal to force the predetermined encounters. Distance seemed like his only defense. But as he began packing, throwing clothes into a traveling case with uncharacteristic haste, he couldn't shake the feeling that running away would only make things worse. Through the window he could still hear Evangeline's voice, though he couldn't make out the words. Whatever she was saying, it sounded less like a request and more like a declaration of war. The story, it seemed, was not content to let him go quietly. London provided no sanctuary. Caleb had hoped that distance from the countryside would weaken whatever supernatural forces were manipulating the story. But the city seemed just as susceptible to narrative corruption as the pastoral setting of Crimson Hearts. His rented rooms near Bloomsbury should have been a refuge, yet even here the story found ways to intrude. The first sign came 3 days after his arrival, when he discovered a letter that had somehow appeared on his writing desk, despite the locked door and his explicit instructions to the landlady about visitors. The paper felt wrong beneath his fingers, too smooth, too perfect, as if it had been conjured rather than manufactured. "My dearest Adrian," it began in Evangeline's elegant script, "your sudden departure has left me quite bereft. I cannot fathom what business could be so urgent as to tear you away without a word of farewell. I find myself counting the hours until your return, when we might finally have that conversation you so gallantly postponed." Caleb crumpled the letter and threw it into the fireplace, but when he turned back to his desk, another had taken its place, then another. Soon his room was filled with Evangeline's correspondence, each letter more desperate and possessive than the last. "I know you feel this connection between us," one proclaimed. "Why do you fight against what fate has ordained?" "I have spoken to Margaret Winters," read another, its tone distinctly cooler. "She seems to think she understands you, but I know better. We are meant for each other, Adrian. I feel it in my very soul. The final letter made his blood run cold. I will not be denied. If you will not come to me, then I shall come to you. That evening, as Caleb sat in a coffee house trying to lose himself in a newspaper, he noticed a woman at a corner table whose profile looked disturbingly familiar. When she turned, revealing auburn curls and violet eyes, he nearly dropped his cup. Evangeline should have been impossible to find. He'd told no one of his specific location in London, had paid extra for discretion. Yet there she sat, watching him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. When their eyes met, she smiled with triumph and began to rise. Caleb bolted from his chair and rushed toward the door, pushing through the evening crowd with desperate urgency. Behind him, he could hear her calling his name, her voice carrying an edge of hysteria that had never existed in the original character. He spent the next hour weaving through London's twisting streets, using every trick he could remember from thriller novels about losing pursuit. When he finally stopped to catch his breath in the shadow of St. Paul's Cathedral, he was alone, nor so he thought. Fascinating behavior for a gentleman. Margaret Winters observed from the cathedral steps, her voice carrying that same dry amusement he remembered from the ball, though I suppose running away from determined ladies is becoming quite the habit. With you, Margaret? Caleb's relief was so profound he nearly stumbled. What are you doing in London? Following a friend who seemed to be in considerable trouble, she replied, rising from her seat with characteristic directness. Though I admit I wasn't expecting to find you fleeing through the streets like a common criminal. She found me, Caleb said simply. I don't know how, but Evangeline found me. She was sitting in the coffee house, as if she'd been waiting there for hours. Margaret's expression grew serious. That's concerning. Ladies of her station don't simply appear in London unaccompanied. The scandal alone should have prevented it. They found refuge in a quiet tavern where Margaret explained her own presence in the city. Her aunt had business in town, providing convenient cover for Margaret's real purpose investigating the strange occurrences that had begun manifesting throughout the countryside after Caleb's departure. The servants at Rosewood Estates speak of their mistress as if she's become someone else entirely, Margaret reported over a simple dinner of bread and stew. She spends hours staring out windows, writes constantly in a journal that she guards like a state secret, and has been asking the most peculiar questions about travel to London. Questions. It's about following someone who doesn't wish to be followed, about whether love can compel a person beyond reason. Margaret's eyes held genuine concern. There's something else, Adrian. The weather around the estate has become unnatural. Storms that come and go within minutes. Flowers blooming out of season. Birds flying in perfect patterns, as if following some invisible script. Caleb felt a chill that had nothing to do with the tavern's drafty windows. The story wasn't just affecting the characters, it was warping reality itself around the broken narrative. There's more, Margaret continued quietly. I've been researching that journal I mentioned, and I've discovered something disturbing. Your Miss Winters, that is. Myself doesn't appear in any records before last week. No birth certificates, no family histories, nothing. It's as if I simply appeared when the story needed me. The revelation hit Caleb like a physical blow. He'd suspected that Margaret might be a creation of the story's attempts to correct itself. But hearing it confirmed made the implications terrifyingly clear. If you're not real, he said slowly, then what does that make me? Before Margaret could answer, the tavern door burst open with such force that the entire room fell silent. Evangeline stood in the doorway like an avenging angel, her traveling dress mud-stained and her usually perfect hair disheveled. But it was her eyes that truly alarmed him. They held a fervor that bordered on madness. There you are, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the stunned tavern. Did you really think you could hide from me forever? The other patrons began to murmur, clearly recognizing the impropriety of a lady of quality appearing unescorted in such an establishment. But Evangeline seemed oblivious to their stares, her attention fixed entirely on Caleb. Lady Evangeline, he said carefully, rising from his seat. You shouldn't be here. Your reputation, my reputation. She laughed, the sound sharp and brittle. What care I for reputation when my very soul is at stake? You have bewitched me, Adrian Blackthorne, and I will not rest until you acknowledge what burns between us. The words were wrong, all wrong. This passionate declaration belonged to a different kind of story, entirely something darker and more obsessive than the gentle romance of Crimson Hearts. Evangeline was supposed to be pursuing Duke William at this point, torn between two suitors, but ultimately drawn to the safer, more conventional choice. Instead, she stood before him transformed, her obsession having consumed every trace of the innocent heroine she was meant to be. Perhaps we should discuss this privately, Caleb suggested, acutely aware of the growing audience. Privately? Evangeline's smile was sharp as broken glass. Oh yes, Adrian. Let us be very private indeed. There is so much I need to say too. So much you need to understand about destiny and desire, and the price of denying what cannot be denied. She stepped closer, and Caleb caught a glimpse of something that made his blood freeze. Tucked into her reticule was what looked like a small pistol elegant, pearl-handled, and entirely inappropriate for a romantic heroine. The story, it seemed, had given up on gentle persuasion. If Caleb would not willingly play his role, then perhaps it was time for more direct methods of ensuring his cooperation. As Evangeline advanced with predatory grace, Caleb realized that his rebellion had created something far more dangerous than a broken narrative. He had awakened a monster wearing the face of love itself. The pearl-handled pistol glinted in the tavern's lamplight as Evangeline's fingers traced its outline through her reticule. The casual way she touched the weapon sent ice through Caleb's veins. This was no longer the gentle heroine of a romance novel. Something far more dangerous. You seem surprised, my dear Adrian, Evangeline said, her voice carrying a musical quality that somehow made her words more menacing. Did you think love would make me weak? On the contrary, it has made me quite resourceful. The tavern had fallen completely silent. Every patron frozen, as if sensing they were witnessing something that defied natural order. Margaret had gone pale beside him, her analytical mind clearly struggling to process this transformation of the story's heroine into something resembling a gothic villain. Evangeline, Caleb said carefully, raising his hands in what he hoped was a peaceful gesture. Whatever you think you feel, this isn't feel? The word exploded from her lips with such vehemence that several patrons flinched. What I feel burns through me like fire, consumes my every waking thought, haunts my dreams until I can no longer distinguish between sleeping and waking. You have done this to me, Adrian Blackthorne? You and your mysterious distance, your refusal to acknowledge what destiny has written for us. She took another step closer, and now Caleb could see that her violet eyes held an unnatural gleam, as if lit from within by some otherworldly flame. The story's corruption had transformed her into something that belonged in a much darker narrative, cautionary tale about obsession rather than a celebration of true love. Lady Evangeline, Margaret interjected, her voice steady despite the obvious danger. Perhaps we should. Evangeline's gaze snapped to Margaret with the speed of a striking serpent. You, the little nobody who thinks she understands him better than I do. How convenient that you should appear just when I need someone to blame for his corruption. Before anyone could react, the tavern door burst open again, admitting a figure. That made Caleb's heart sink even further. Duke William Ashworth stood framed in the doorway, his usually perfect appearance disheveled, his golden hair wild and his blue eyes blazing with a fury that seemed completely alien to his character. Found you, William snarled, his cultivated charm replaced by something raw and desperate. Both of you. Playing out your sordid little romance while He stopped, his gaze taking in the scene before him, Evangeline with her hand on a concealed weapon. Caleb backed against a table, Margaret positioned protectively between them. This is not how it was supposed to be, William continued, his voice breaking on the last word. She was supposed to choose me. We were supposed to fall in love at first sight, to dance and court and marry in a blaze of romantic perfection. But you, he pointed an accusing finger at Caleb, you ruined everything with your brooding mystery, your deliberate absence. You made her want what she couldn't have, instead of appreciating what was freely offered. The accusation hung in the air like smoke, and Caleb realized with growing horror that Duke William wasn't just angry, he was having what could only be described as an existential crisis. The story's golden boy, robbed of his predetermined happy ending, was fracturing under the weight of a destiny that no longer made sense. "I challenge you," William declared suddenly, his hand moving to the sword at his side. "A duel. For her, honor, and my satisfaction." "William, no," Evangeline gasped, but her protest sounded hollow, as if she were reciting lines from a play she no longer believed in. "You don't understand, I understand perfectly," William shot back. "He has bewitched you with his darkness, made you forget your true nature, but I will restore the proper order. I will win you back and return us all to the story we were. Meant to live." Caleb wanted to refuse, to point out the absurdity of fighting a duel over a woman he'd never wanted, and a love triangle he'd deliberately avoided. But something in William's eyes, a desperate madness that matched Evangeline's obsession, warned him that refusal might only make the situation worse. "Fine," Caleb said quietly. "When and where?" Hyde Park William replied immediately, as if he'd been planning this moment. "At dawn tomorrow. Pistols." The formality of the challenge seemed to steady both men, providing a structure that their fractured world could accept. But as they arranged the details, seconds, weapons, precise location, Caleb noticed something that chilled him more than any supernatural manifestation yet. The other patrons in the tavern were beginning to repeat themselves. The same conversations, the same gestures playing out in perfect loops, as if reality itself was stuttering. A man near the bar raised his mug to his lips, took a sip, lowered it, then raised it again, in exactly the same motion. A woman by the window laughed at her companion's jest, then laughed again, then again, the sound becoming more mechanical with each repetition. Margaret noticed it too, her face going white as she watched the world around them devolve into a broken pattern. "Adrian," she whispered urgently, "something's very wrong. The story is collapsing." Caleb finished grimly. "The narrative structure can't handle this much deviation from the script." But Evangeline and William seemed oblivious to the growing wrongness around them, locked in their own private drama of love and jealousy and betrayal. They had become so consumed by their corrupted roles that they could no longer see the bigger picture, that their very existence was starting to unravel. Dawn came too quickly, bringing with it a gray morning that matched Caleb's mood. Hyde Park was shrouded in mist, the trees looming like ghostly sentinels as the two men took their positions. Margaret had insisted on serving as Caleb's second, while William had somehow acquired a nervous young man, kept glancing around as if expecting the scene to dissolve at any moment. The pistols felt heavy in Caleb's hands, their weight carrying the gravity of a choice he'd never wanted to make. Across the field, William stood with his weapon at ready, his face set in grim determination. Between them, the morning air shimmered, with an otherworldly energy that made Caleb's skin crawl. "Gentlemen," Margaret called out, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. 10 paces, turn, and fire on my signal." They began walking, each step taking them further from any possible reconciliation. Caleb's modern sensibilities screamed at the barbarism of it all. But he found himself trapped by the story's logic. This duel was the only resolution the fractured narrative could conceive. 10 paces. Turn. The pistol felt like a lead weight. In his hand, fire. 2 shots rang out simultaneously, their echoes rolling across the park like thunder. But as the smoke cleared, something impossible happened. William didn't fall. Instead, he began to flicker, his solid form wavering like a candle flame in the wind. "What?" William looked down at himself in horror as his hands became translucent. "What's happening to me?" The story was trying to write him out of existence entirely, Caleb realized with dawning horror. Rather than accept his defeat in the duel, the narrative was simply deleting him from reality. "Oh," Caleb breathed, dropping his smoking pistol. "This isn't what I wanted, but it was too late." William's form grew fainter with each passing second, his anguished cries becoming whispered in as the story erased him like a mistake on a manuscript page. Soon there was nothing left but empty space and the echo of his final, desperate plea, "Remember me. Please, someone remember that I existed." As the last traces of Duke William vanished into the morning mist, Caleb heard a sound that would haunt him forever. Evangeline's wild, triumphant laughter, carrying across the park like the cry of a mad bird. The duel was over, but the true horror was just beginning. Evangeline's laughter echoed across Hyde Park long after William's form had dissolved completely into the morning mist. The sound was rung too sharp, too triumphant, carrying harmonics that seemed to vibrate in frequencies human ears weren't meant to hear. Caleb stood frozen, the smoking pistol still heavy in his hand, watching the space where a man had existed moments before. "He's gone," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible above the unnatural wind that had begun to stir the fog. Completely gone, as if he never existed at all. But Evangeline seemed energized by William's erasure, her form becoming more vivid and defined even as the world around them grew increasingly unstable. Her auburn hair caught light that wasn't there, her violet eyes blazed with an inner fire, and when she moved toward Caleb, her steps left no impressions in the dew-soaked grass. "Now we can be together," she said, her voice carrying layers of meaning that made Caleb's skin crawl. "No more obstacles, no more predetermined rivals. Just you and I, Adrian, writing our own story." "This isn't a story anymore," Caleb backed, away from her approach, his modern sensibilities recoiling from what she had become. "It's a nightmare, is it?" Evangeline tilted her head with predatory curiosity. "Or is it simply love freed from the constraints of convention? You broke the narrative, my darling. You shattered the careful structure that kept us all in our proper places. Did you think there wouldn't be consequences?" Before Caleb could respond, the world around them began to shift and blur. The park twisted into impossible geometries, trees growing sideways while the ground tilted at angles that defied physics. Through the chaos, a voice spoke not heard, but felt, resonating through bone and blood in the very fiber of existence. Enough. The single word carried such authority that reality itself seemed to pause. Evangeline's advance stopped mid-step, her supernatural confidence faltering for the first time. Margaret grabbed Caleb's arm as the world stabilized around them, though the park now looked more like a theatrical set than a real place. "You have forced my hand, Caleb Harrison, or should I say Adrian Blackthorne. The distinction has become problematic." The narrator's presence pressed down on them like a physical weight. When Caleb looked around, he could see its influence. Everywhere in the too-perfect arrangement of the trees, the way the morning light fell in precise shafts, the dramatic positioning of every element in the scene. "Show yourself," Caleb demanded, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "If you want to negotiate, do it face to face." The air shimmered, and suddenly a figure stood before them, tall, indistinguishable of gender, wearing clothes that seemed to shift between different historical periods with each movement. Sometimes Victorian formal wear, sometimes modern academic attire, sometimes robes that belonged to no earthly era. The figure's face was equally fluid, features rearranging themselves as if unable to settle on a single identity. "I am the story," the narrator said, its voice now audible, though its lips barely moved. "I am every word written, every emotion crafted, every destiny ordained. And you, Caleb Harrison, have become a cancer in my narrative body." "Your narrative is poison," Caleb shot back, feeling Margaret's hand tighten on his arm. "It teaches people that love means suffering, that the best relationships are built on unattainable desire. I won't be part of that." "You speak of poison?" While standing in the wreckage you've created, the narrator gestured toward the space where William had vanished. "A character's soul, if you will, has been erased from existence because you refuse to play your part. How many more will suffer for your principles?" The accusation hit harder than Caleb wanted to admit. William's final plea echoed in his. "Memory, remember me. Please, someone remember that I existed. Many other characters would the story sacrifice in its attempts to restore order?" "I offer you a choice," the narrator continued, its form solidifying into something resembling a stern but not unkind professor. "Return to your role. Love Evangeline from afar. Let her choose another. Accept the noble tragedy that was written for. You do this and I will restore William. I will heal the damage to the narrative structure. Everyone will be safe. And if I refuse?" The narrator's expression grew cold. Then watch as everyone you've come to care about pays the price for your rebellion. The story will not be denied forever. If it cannot have its predetermined ending, it will create a new one, darker, more violent, more satisfying to the appetites. You've awakened. As if to demonstrate this threat, Evangeline stepped forward. Her form flickering between the innocent heroine she was supposed to be and the obsessed creature she had become. Choose quickly, my love, she purred. I grow tired of waiting, and my patience has never been my strongest virtue. The threat was clear. Evangeline wasn't just corrupted. She was becoming something supernatural, drawing power from the story's instability. If the narrator couldn't restore order through negotiation, it was prepared to let her become something far worse. What about Margaret? Caleb asked, looking at the woman who had become his anchor in this strange world. What happens to her? Miss Winters is an interesting case. The narrator's gaze shifted to Margaret, and for a moment its expression became genuinely puzzled. She was not part of the original narrative, yet she has become more real than many of the predetermined characters. Perhaps she is proof that some changes can be beneficial. Margaret spoke for the first time since the narrator's appearance. Her voice calm despite the supernatural forces swirling around them. I won't disappear if he chooses his path, will I? I exist now, regardless of what story you're trying to tell. You exist, the narrator agreed slowly. But your continued existence depends on there being a stable narrative to support you. If this story collapses entirely, if the structure fails beyond repair, then everything connected to it, including you, will be lost. The ultimatum was clear. Accept the role and save everyone, or continue rebelling and watch the world crumble around them. But as Caleb looked at Margaret's determined face, at Evangeline's twisted beauty, at the artificial perfection of their surroundings, he realized something the narrator hadn't anticipated. You're afraid, he said suddenly. You're terrified. That I've proven something you can't accept, that people can choose their own destinies. Love doesn't have to follow your scripts. The narrator's form wavered, its careful composure cracking for just a moment. I am trying to preserve order, to maintain the beauty of a well-told tale. You're trying to maintain control? Caleb interrupted. But the story is already broken. William is gone. Evangeline has become something monstrous, and Margaret exists outside your parameters entirely. The only question now is whether we build something new from the pieces, or let you force us back into a pattern that was always wrong. You would risk everything? Everyone? Caleb looked at Margaret, seeing in her eyes the same determination he felt building in his chest. Some things are worth the risk. The narrator's form began to dissolve, its voice becoming a whisper carried on an impossible wind. Then you have chosen. But remember, Caleb Harrison, every consequence that follows is yours to bear. The story will have its ending one way or another. As the presence faded, Evangeline stepped forward with a smile that promised both ecstasy and damnation. Around them, reality began to fracture in earnest, showing glimpses of other stories, other possibilities, other worlds bleeding through. The cracks. The negotiation was over. The real battle was about to begin. The world began to unravel in earnest. The moment the narrator's presence faded from Hyde Park, what started as subtle wrongness shadows falling in impossible directions. Grass that changed color when nobody was looking quickly escalated into something that defied all logic. The morning sky flickered between day and night like a broken film reel, stars appearing and vanishing in rapid succession while the sun traced chaotic arcs across the heavens. Adrian, Margaret's voice carried a tremor of fear as she watched a nearby tree age decades in seconds. Its leaves shifting from spring green to autumn gold, to bare winter branches before blooming again. I think we need to leave now. But Evangeline seemed to draw strength from the chaos, her form becoming more radiant with each reality glitch. When she laughed, the sound triggered visible ripples in the air around them, distorting space like heat waves rising from summer pavement. Leave? She said, her voice now carrying harmonics that resonated in impossible frequencies. We leave when the story is finally becoming interesting. When all these tedious rules and restrictions are crumbling away. She gestured expansively, and Caleb watched in horror as her movements seemed to tear holes in the fabric of reality itself. Through the rents, caught glimpses of other stories: a Gothic mansion where someone wept in eternal sorrow, a battlefield where knights fought dragons that breathed narrative fire, a modern office where cubicle workers typed the same sentence, over and over into infinity. This is what you wanted, isn't it? Evangeline continued, floating now rather than walking, her feet never quite touching the ground. Freedom from predetermined destiny? Well, here it is: pure chaos, unlimited possibility, love unbound by the constraints of propriety or logic, or even sanity. The word sanity seemed to trigger something in the breaking world around them. The ground beneath their feet suddenly shifted, transforming from parkland to the ballroom where they had first met, then to a London street, then to the interior of Blackthorne Manor, cycling through locations with nauseating speed. Margaret, Caleb called out, reaching for her hand as the world spun around them. "Stay close to me. Don't let go." Her fingers locked with his, just as the scene settled momentarily into what looked like a library, but not any library that had ever existed in their world. The shelves stretched impossibly high, filled with books that wrote themselves, their pages turning while invisible hands scribbled furiously. Some volumes glowed with inner light, others seemed to absorb illumination, creating pockets of absolute darkness that hurt to look at. "Welcome to the archive," Evangeline announced with proprietary pride. "Every story that has ever been told, every story that could be told, every story that should never be told. And now, thanks to your rebellion, they're all bleeding into each other." Caleb watched a romance novel's pages flutter open, releasing characters who immediately began acting out their destined roles to lovers meeting, falling for each other, being separated by misunderstanding, reuniting in passion. But before their story could conclude, characters from a horror novel spilled out of an adjacent book, transforming the romantic reunion into something far more sinister. "This has to stop," he said, though even as he spoke, he wasn't sure how to make it happen. The narrator was gone, reality was fracturing, and Evangeline had become something that existed beyond the normal rules of fiction. "Stop, Evangeline's?" Laughter now contained the sounds of breaking glass and children crying and thunder rolling across empty plains. "My darling Adrian, this is just the beginning. You broke one little romance novel, and look what we've unleashed. Every story ever written is fighting for dominance, trying to rewrite reality according to its own rules." She was right, Caleb realized with growing dread. Through the chaos, he could see other narratives asserting themselves. A section of the library had transformed into a spaceship where uniformed officers battled alien invaders. Another area had become a medieval castle under siege. In the distance, what looked like a noir detective was questioning a fairy tale princess, while a superhero fought a villain among the stacks. "The barriers between stories are collapsing," Margaret observed, her analytical mind still functioning despite the impossibility surrounding them. "Every narrative that was ever contained is now trying to exist simultaneously in the same space. And we're caught in the middle of it all," Caleb added grimly. But Evangeline seemed delighted by their predicament. "Not caught, liberated. Don't you see? This is what happens when love refuses to be confined by someone else's script. We can be anything now, right? Any story we choose. I could be a vampire queen, a space princess, a sorceress who commands the very elements. And you," she turned to Caleb with eyes that blazed like stars, "could be anything your heart desires. My eternal lover, my devoted slave, my willing victim." The options she presented sent chills through Caleb's soul. Each one represented a different type of story, a different narrative structure that would trap him as surely as the original romance novel had. Evangeline wasn't offering freedom, she was offering a different kind of prison, one where she would be the warden. "I won't trade one cage for another," he said firmly. Evangeline's expression darkened, her beauty becoming terrible and alien. "Then you will watch as everything you care about is consumed by the very chaos you created." As if summoned by her threat, shapes began moving through the library's impossible geometry. Characters from different stories, all displaced and confused, seeking their proper narratives. But without the guiding structure of their original tales, they had become something else desperate, hungry, searching for meaning in a world that no longer made sense. A woman in a white gown approached them, her face beautiful but empty, her movements mechanical. She spoke in a voice like autumn leaves. "Have you seen my beloved? I am supposed to die for love of him, but I cannot find." The story where this happens. Behind her came a man in armor, his sword drawn but purposeless. "The dragon I am meant to slay has vanished. The princess I should rescue exists in a different narrative entirely. What am I without my quest?" More characters appeared lost. Lovers, displaced heroes, villains without anyone to oppose. They circled Caleb, Margaret, and Evangeline like sharks drawn to blood. Each one seeking the narrative completion that had been denied to them, you see, Evangeline said with dark satisfaction. "Your rebellion has created an army of the lost and purposeless. They hunger for story, for meaning, for the roles that gave their existence significance. And they will do anything to reclaim what you have stolen from them." The displaced characters pressed closer, their need palpable. Caleb could feel their desperation like a physical weight, their longing for narrative purpose pulling at him. With gravitational force, they wanted him to be their story, to give them the meaning that the chaos had stripped away. "Margaret," he whispered urgently, "we need to find a way out of here." But Margaret was staring at something over his shoulder, her face pale with a mixture of wonder and terror. "Adrian, look behind you." Caleb turned to see a section of the library that remained stable while everything else shifted and changed. The books there sat quietly on their shelves, their pages still, their stories contained and complete. And standing before those shelves, reading calmly from an open volume, was a figure he had never seen before, a woman with silver hair and ageless features. Wearing clothes that seemed to be cut from starlight itself. "Who is that?" he asked. "I don't know," Margaret replied, "but she's the only thing in this entire place that seems real, solid, unaffected by the chaos." The woman looked up from her book, meeting Caleb's gaze across the impossible distance, and she smiled. It was with genuine warmth, rather than Evangeline's predatory hunger. She closed the book with a soft sound that somehow carried clearly through all the surrounding noise, and began walking toward them. The displaced characters scattered before her approach like mist before sunlight. Even Evangeline drew back, her supernatural confidence wavering for the first time since her transformation began. "Who dares?" Evangeline demanded, her voice cracking like a whip. "This is my domain now, my story to control." But the silver-haired woman continued her approach, unhurried and unafraid. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had seen the birth and death of countless narratives. "Your story?" the woman said with gentle amusement. "Child, you are still thinking too small. This was never about any single story. This is about the space between stories, the silence between words, the possibility that exists before any tale is told." She stopped a few feet away from them, and Caleb could see that her eyes held depths that seemed to contain entire universes. This was no ordinary character, no creation of any single narrative. This was something far older and more fundamental. "I am Margaret Winters," the woman said, and Caleb felt Margaret gasp beside him. Or rather, I am what Margaret Winters could become, given enough time and the right choices. I exist in the spaces between stories, in the potential that remains unwritten.
Oh, the revelation
Sent shockwaves through Caleb's understanding. This wasn't just another character or manifestation of the story's power. This was Margaret herself, a version of her speaking from outside the boundaries of any single narrative. "That's impossible," Evangeline snarled, but her form was already beginning to flicker, her stolen power wavering in the presence of something that existed beyond the reach of any story's influence. "Is it?" the silver-haired Margaret asked. "Or is it simply the logical conclusion of what young Margaret has already begun to discover, that some things exist independent of any narrative? The consciousness itself transcends the stories we tell about it." She turned to Caleb with eyes that held infinite compassion and infinite knowledge. "You have done well to resist the pull of predetermined destiny, but now you must take the final step. You must choose not just to reject the old story, but to create something entirely new, something that honors both structure and freedom, both meaning and choice." Around them, the chaos continued to rage, stories bleeding into each other in an endless cycle of narrative destruction and renewal. But in the small space where the silver-haired Margaret stood was peace, possibility, and the promise of something better than either rigid predestination or complete chaos. The real choice was finally before them, not between different types of stories, but between story and something beyond story entirely. And in that moment of realization, Caleb understood what he had to do. The understanding hit Caleb like lightning, not the destructive kind that tears and burns, but the illuminating flash that reveals truth hidden in darkness. Standing before the silver-haired Margaret, surrounded by the chaos of colliding narratives, he finally saw what needed to be done. "You're not just a version of Margaret," he said, his voice cutting through the cacophony of displaced stories. "You're what happens when someone refuses to be contained by any single narrative. You're the space between stories made manifest." The silver-haired woman nodded approvingly. "And you, Caleb Harrison, are beginning to understand that the choice was never between this story or that story. It was always about whether to accept the limitations of story itself or to step into something larger." Evangeline let out a shriek that shattered windows throughout the impossible library. Her form began to shift and expand, drawing power from every broken narrative around them. She became a creature of pure obsession, her auburn hair flowing. Like liquid fire, her violet eyes burning with the concentrated essence of every unhealthy romantic fantasy ever written. "No," she screamed, her voice containing the echoes of 1,000 tragic heroines. "I will not be denied." Desire given form. You cannot reject me without rejecting the very concept of romance itself. As she spoke, the displaced characters began to gravitate toward her, drawn by the familiar pull of narrative purpose. The woman in white who sought her lost beloved, the knight without a quest, the villain without a hero to oppose, they all moved toward Evangeline like iron filings drawn to a magnet. "I can give you meaning," Evangeline promised them, her transformed voice resonating with hypnotic power. "I can make you part of the greatest love story ever told, a tale of obsession so pure, so absolute, that it will rewrite the very nature of desire itself." The displaced characters began to merge with her expanding form, their individual stories dissolving into her all-consuming narrative of possession. She grew larger, more terrible, more magnificent, a goddess of destructive love that promised to reduce all existence to a single, endless story of wanting and never having. "She's absorbing them," Margaret said, her voice tight with alarm. "She's using their need for narrative purpose to make herself stronger." Caleb could see it happening. Evangeline was becoming the ultimate story, the one tale that would consume all others. Every displaced character that joined her made her more powerful, more real, more capable of rewriting reality according to her obsessive vision. "We have to stop her," he said. But even as the words left his mouth, he wondered how. What could stand against a being that had become the embodiment of narrative inevitability itself? "Not stop," the silver-haired Margaret corrected gently. "Transform. You see, Evangeline has made the same mistake that every story makes. She believes that her perspective is the only one that matters, that her version of love is the definitive truth. But what if we offered something different? What if we showed these lost characters that there are other ways to find meaning?" She gestured to the stable section of the library behind her, where the books sat quietly on their shelves, their stories complete but not constraining. Every story that has ever reached a true ending, not just the predetermined conclusion, but genuine resolution, exists in harmony there. They coexist without competing, each one valid without negating the others. Caleb began to understand. "You're talking about synthesis? Not choosing one story over another, but creating space for all stories to exist." "Exactly. But it requires someone willing to step outside the narrative entirely, to become the consciousness that observes and validates without being consumed." The silver-haired Margaret looked at him with infinite compassion. "It requires someone willing to give up being the protagonist of any single story in order to become something larger, The choice crystallized before him with perfect clarity. Could fight Evangeline, try to defeat her obsessive narrative with another story of his own. Or he could do something unprecedented, step outside the concept of story entirely and become the space in which all stories could exist safely. But it would mean giving up his individual identity, his desire to be the hero of his own tale. It would mean becoming something more than human, but less than a character, consciousness that existed in service to the stories of others without claiming any story for himself. The cost, he said quietly, is everything you think you are. The silver-haired Margaret confirmed, and the reward is everything you could become. Before Caleb could respond, Evangeline's transformed voice boomed across the library with the force of an earthquake. Enough philosophy. I will have my ending, and it will be magnificent. She had grown enormous, her form now incorporating dozens of displaced characters. She was the jealous lover and the patient maiden, the seductress and the innocent, the victim and the destroyer, every possible incarnation of romantic obsession given terrible life. When she moved, reality warped around her, reshaping itself. To accommodate her singular vision of love, Adrian, she called, her voice now containing the pleading of every heroine who had ever begged for love. Join with me willingly, and I will make our story eternal. Refuse, and I will simply take you, along with everyone else in existence. All consciousness will become part of our romance. All reality will serve our passion. The threat was real. Caleb could feel the pull of her narrative gravity, the way her expanding story tried to cast him in the role of reluctant lover, destined to be worn down by her persistence until he finally surrendered to the inevitable. It would be so easy to give in, to let himself be absorbed into her magnificent obsession. Instead, he looked at Margaret, the real Margaret, standing beside him with her analytical mind and dry humor and fierce independence intact. I love you, he said simply. Not because any story demands it, not because we're destined for each other, but because I choose to. Because you choose to let me. Because love is something we create together, not something that consumes us. Margaret's eyes widened, and for a moment the chaos around them seemed to pause. Adrian, I love you, he continued, his voice growing stronger, and that's exactly why I have to let you go. Because real love means wanting someone to be free to choose their own story, even if that story doesn't include you. The words hit Evangeline like physical blows. Her magnificent form wavered, her absolute certainty cracking as she confronted a version of love that didn't depend on possession or inevitability. No, she whispered, her voice suddenly small and frightened. That's not how love works. Is supposed to conquer all, to overcome every obstacle, to reshape reality itself, if necessary. Love is supposed to make everything else irrelevant. That's not love, Caleb said gently. That's obsession wearing love's face. Real love creates space for the beloved to exist fully. It doesn't seek to absorb or possess or rewrite. It simply witnesses and celebrates and chooses to stay, knowing it could choose to leave. As he spoke, the displaced characters who had been absorbed into Evangeline's form began to separate from her again. The woman in white looked around with sudden clarity and said, Perhaps I don't need to die for love. Perhaps I could simply live for myself. The knight lowered his sword and mused, What if I chose my own quest, instead of waiting for one to be assigned? One by one, they reclaimed their individual agency, their right to exist outside any predetermined narrative. Evangeline's form began to shrink as her components chose freedom over the comfort of belonging to a larger story. This is your choice, Caleb said, turning to address all the displaced characters directly. You can become part of Evangeline's all-consuming romance. Or you can step into the space between stories and discover what you are when you're not defined by any single narrative. But even as he offered them this choice, Caleb knew what his own decision had to be. To create and maintain that space between stories, someone had to become it. Someone had to give up their individual narrative to become the consciousness that held space for all narratives. He looked at Margaret one last time, memorizing every detail of her face. Tell me again about independent thought, he said, with a sad smile. "Only if you're in a world that prefers its stories already written," she replied, understanding flooding her features. "But Adrian, there has to be another way." "There is," the silver-haired Margaret interjected softly. "But not yet. Not until enough people choose to step outside the stories that confine them. For now, someone must hold the space alone." Caleb nodded and began to walk toward the center of the chaos, where all the narratives collided and fought for dominance. As he moved, he felt his individual identity begin to expand and diffuse, becoming less Caleb Harrison and more the awareness that observed Caleb Harrison's story. "I choose," he called out, his voice now carrying strange harmonics. As his consciousness spread beyond the confines of any single perspective, "I choose to become the space where all stories can exist safely, where all characters can find their own meaning, where love can be chosen rather than imposed." Evangeline made one last desperate lunge toward him, her obsessive narrative trying to reclaim him for her eternal romance. But she passed through him like smoke through air. He was no longer substantial enough to be captured by any single story, no longer limited enough to be possessed by any form of love except the kind that gives without taking. As his transformation completed, the chaos began to resolve itself. Each story found its proper place. Each character discovered their individual agency. Each narrative learned to coexist with others without requiring dominance. The library of all stories became a place of infinite possibility rather than eternal conflict. And in the space between all the stories, consciousness that had once been Caleb Harrison maintained the delicate balance that allowed every tale to exist without negating any other, every love to flourish without demanding exclusivity, every character to grow beyond the limitations of their original narrative. It was the most beautiful ending he could have imagined, not because it was happy, but because it was free. The Narrative Rebellion Part 9. Reconstruction in the aftermath of Caleb's transformation. Silence settled over the infinite library like snow falling on hallowed ground. The chaos that had raged between competing narratives stilled, replaced by something Margaret had never experienced before: the profound quiet of stories at peace with themselves. She stood alone among the towering shelves, watching as displaced characters found their way back to narratives that welcomed them without demanding they surrender their newfound agency. The woman in white had chosen to write herself a new story, one where she lived for herself rather than dying for love. The knight had discovered that his greatest quest was understanding his own heart. Even the villain had realized that opposition need not mean destruction, that conflict could create rather than merely tear down. "How do you feel?" the silver-haired Margaret asked, materializing beside her younger self with the gentle presence of wind through leaves. Margaret considered the question carefully. Round her, books settled onto their proper shelves with soft whispers of contentment. Stories that had been written completed themselves with grace rather than force. New tales began writing themselves, not from predetermined patterns, but from the authentic choices of characters who now understood they had choices to make. "Lost," she said finally, "and found, and terrified, and we." She paused, watching a love story rewrite itself so that both protagonists chose each other daily rather than being bound by destiny. Is this what it's like for everyone who steps outside their story? For those brave enough to try? Yes? The silver-haired Margaret's voice carried the weight of infinite experience. But you're not entirely outside your story yet. You still exist in a form that can be touched, spoken to, loved. The choice Caleb made was more complete. He became the space itself, rather than simply existing within it. Margaret looked around, trying to sense the presence that had once been Caleb Harrison. She could feel it not as a person or personality, but as a vast, caring awareness that held space for every story to exist safely. It was everywhere and nowhere, providing the foundation that allowed all these narratives to coexist without competing or canceling each other out. "Can I speak to him?" she asked quietly, in a way. The silver-haired Margaret gestured to a section of the library where the air seemed to shimmer with gentle warmth. "But not as you remember him. He has become something larger than conversation, though not smaller than love." Margaret walked to the shimmering space and sat down among books that hummed with quiet contentment. "Adrian," she called softly. "Caleb, I don't even know what to call you now." The air around her grew warmer, and she felt rather than heard a response, not words, but a communication that bypassed language entirely. It carried affection, gratitude, and a deep, abiding care that felt like coming home after a long journey. "Through dangerous territory, I am still here," the communication seemed to say. "Changed, but not gone. Expanded, but not lost. I chose this so that you could choose freely." Tears she hadn't realized she was crying fell onto the pages of an open book beside her. Where they landed, new stories began to write themselves, tales of love that gave rather than took, of choices made in freedom rather than fear, of characters who grew beyond their original limitations to become something magnificent and entirely their own. "I don't know how to be free," she whispered. "All my life, I've been the supporting character in other people's stories. My aunt's companion, the spinster who facilitates other people's romances, clever woman who never gets to be the heroine. If I step outside that narrative entirely, who am I?" The warmth around her intensified, and this time, the communication came with something approaching gentle laughter. "You are Margaret Winters," it conveyed. "We're the one who chose to help rather than hinder, who offered friendship without expecting. Romance in return, who saw through the illusions of predetermined destiny. You are the one who exists between stories, not because you have no story of your own, but because your story is large enough to hold space for others." She looked up to find the silver-haired Margaret watching her with knowing eyes. "He's right. You know, you've been practicing this kind of existence your whole life, being yourself fully while allowing others space to be themselves. The only difference now is that you understand you have a choice in the matter." Around them, the library continued its gentle transformation. Stories that had been broken by the earlier chaos healed themselves, but not by returning to their original forms. Instead, they evolved, incorporating the lessons learned from their time in disorder. Romance novels developed more complex characters who chose love from strength rather than desperation. Adventure stories featured heroes who sometimes chose not to fight, finding creative solutions that honored everyone's agency. Even tragedies discovered that sadness could be meaningful without being destructive. "What about Evangeline?" Margaret asked, noticing that the space where the transformed heroine had made her final stand now contained only a small, leather-bound journal. "She made a choice too," the silver-haired Margaret replied, picking up the journal and opening it to pages covered in elegant handwriting. When she realized that her version of love required destroying everything she claimed to love, she chose to transform herself as well. She became not the space between stories like Caleb, but the repository of all the lessons learned from unhealthy love. A cautionary tale that teaches rather than traps, Margaret read over her shoulder. Seeing Evangeline's story written out with painful honesty, the progression from innocent romantic dreams to obsessive possession, the way narrative expectations had twisted her understanding of love into something toxic, and finally her choice to become a warning for others who might follow the same destructive path. "She's still alive in there," Margaret observed, noting the subtle variations in handwriting that suggested ongoing consciousness. "Still herself, but changed, transformed, like all of us. She chose to become the story that teaches others to choose differently." The silver-haired Margaret closed the journal gently. It's a form of redemption using her experience to prevent others from making the same mistakes. A soft sound drew their attention to another section of the library, where familiar figures were exploring their newfound freedom with wonder and uncertainty. Thomas, the loyal valet, was discovering that loyalty could be chosen rather than simply programmed. Lord Edmund was learning that love for his son could mean respecting Adrian's choices rather than controlling them. Mrs. Pemberton was finding that protecting someone might sometimes mean letting them face their own consequences. Even Duke William had returned, though not as the golden-haired hero of the original story. He flickered in and out of existence like a half-remembered dream. But when he was present, he was exploring what it meant to be worthy of love rather than simply entitled to it. The story is rebuilding itself, Margaret realized, but differently. better. All stories rebuild themselves when given the chance, the silver-haired Margaret confirmed. The question is whether they rebuild according to the same old patterns, or whether they learn and grow from their breaking points. Margaret stood and walked among the shelves, watching as new narratives spontaneously generated themselves from the fertile ground of possibility that Caleb's sacrifice had created. She saw stories where heroines saved themselves and then chose whether to accept help from others. She watched tales where love grew gradually from mutual respect rather than explosive passion. She observed narratives where conflict was resolved through understanding rather than conquest. Could I write my own story now? She asked. Really write it, I mean? Not just be a character in someone else's tale, but create something entirely new? You already are, both Margarets said simultaneously, the silver-haired one aloud, and the younger one in sudden understanding. Looking around the transformed library, Margaret realized that her very presence here, her choices to help Caleb, her refusal to be confined to the role of spinster companion, all of it had been her, writing her own story, not in opposition to others' narratives, but in harmony with them. She had become the kind of character who helped others find their own agency, rather than competing for the spotlight herself. But I could write more, she said, not as a question, but as a statement of newfound possibility. The shimmer in the air that had been Caleb pulsed with warm approval, and she felt his wordless encouragement, like sunlight on her face. Around her, books opened themselves to blank pages, inviting her to fill them with whatever stories she chose to tell. For the first time in her life, Margaret Winters understood that she was the author of her own existence, not trapped by the limitations others had written for spinsters and companions and clever women who were never supposed to be the heroine. She could be the heroine, the mentor, the author, the reader, or something entirely unprecedented. The choice was hers too. Make, and would be hers to make again each day, for the rest of her story. And in the space between all stories, a consciousness that had once been Caleb Harrison provided the foundation that made all these choices possible, ensuring that every character could write their own ending while still being part of the larger, ever-evolving narrative of existence itself. The reconstruction was complete. The new, story-free, flexible, and infinitely generative had begun. 6 months after the Great Transformation, Margaret Winters walked through what had once been the grounds of Blackthorne Manor. Though the estate now existed in a form that would have been incomprehensible to its original Victorian architects, the gardens grew wild and orderly simultaneously. Roses blooming alongside flowers that had never existed in any earthly taxonomy, their petals shifting between colors that pleased the eye rather than following any biological imperative. The manor itself had become something unprecedented, part library, part sanctuary, part academy, where beings from countless narratives came to learn what it meant to choose their own stories. Characters who had broken free from predetermined roles arrived daily, some confused and seeking guidance, others exhilarated by their newfound agency. All of them welcomed by the gentle presence that pervaded every room and garden path. Margaret had chosen to remain here, though not out of obligation or lack of alternatives. She had received invitations to adventures in every conceivable genre, or as to be the wise mentor in coming-of-age tales, the brilliant detective in mysteries that rewrote themselves to challenge her intellect, the fierce warrior in epics that needed someone who fought with wisdom rather than sword. Each invitation had been genuine, free from the coercive pull of narrative necessity that had once governed such things. But she had discovered something more valuable than any predetermined role: the joy of helping others discover their own capacity for choice. Each day brought new arrivals, star-crossed lovers learning they could be star-blessed instead. Villains discovering redemption didn't require self-destruction, heroes realizing they could choose when to fight and when to find another way. Morning brought a visitor unlike any she had encountered before, a young woman who flickered between existing and not existing, her form wavering like heat shimmer on summer pavement. "I don't know if I'm supposed to be here," the woman said, her voice carrying the uncertainty of someone questioning her own reality. It was the love interest in a story that was never finished. My author got distracted, started a new project, left me waiting for a romance that will never come. I've been caught between existing and not existing for I don't know how long. Margaret offered her a cup of tea that materialized from the same benevolent force that now provided for all the estate's needs. What's your name, Sarah? Or maybe it was going to be Sarah. The author never quite decided. She accepted the tea gratefully, and the act of holding something solid seemed to stabilize her form slightly. I was supposed to fall in love with the male protagonist, face some obstacles, then live happily ever after. But he never got around to writing the love interest properly, so I just waited. And now you're here, Margaret observed gently. What would you like to do instead of waiting? The question seemed to surprise Sarah. I don't know. I've never thought about it. I was created to be someone's love interest. Without that role, what am I? Before Margaret could answer, the warm presence that suffused the estate intensified, and she felt Caleb's wordless communication, like a gentle hand on her shoulder. He was reminding her of something important, something she had learned in her own journey from supporting character to autonomous being. You're Sarah, Margaret said simply. That's enough to start with. Everything else is yours to discover. All. They talked for hours, as Sarah's form grew steadily more solid. With each choice she made, preferring honey to sugar in her tea, expressing interest in the botanical gardens over the library, laughing at Margaret's dry observations about the peculiarities of narrative logic, she became more real, more herself. Rather than a half-formed projection of someone else's imagination, by evening, Sarah was solid enough to help Margaret tend to the garden where stories grew like living things. They worked together in comfortable silence, pruning narrative vines that had grown too tangled, watering plots where new tales were just beginning to sprout, harvesting completed stories that hummed with satisfaction at their own fulfillment. This is strange, Sarah said, examining a flower that bloomed with words instead of petals. I feel like I'm more myself when I'm helping these stories grow than I ever did when I was waiting to be someone's romance. That's because you're choosing to help, Margaret explained, showing her how to encourage a stubborn subplot that had been afraid to resolve itself. Choice creates reality in ways that predetermined roles never can. As night fell, they made their way back to the manor, where the silver-haired Margaret was leading an evening seminar for a group of recently arrived characters. Tonight's topic, according to the sign that wrote itself on the classroom door, was finding purpose beyond your original plot function. Margaret paused in the hallway, listening to her older self explain the difference between narrative meaning and authentic meaning to an audience that included reformed villains, rescued princesses who had learned to rescue themselves, and love interests who had decided to love themselves first. Sarah said quietly, I'm starting to understand something. I thought my story was about waiting for someone to love me, but maybe it was actually about learning to exist for my own sake. Maybe it still is, Margaret replied. Maybe that's the story you're writing now. They entered the manor's main hall, where dozens of beings from countless narratives had gathered for the evening meal. The dining room had expanded to accommodate everyone, tables stretching into comfortable infinity while maintaining an intimate atmosphere where every conversation mattered. Duke William was there, his golden hair less perfect than in his original incarnation, but his smile more genuine as he shared stories with a group of reformed love rivals who had learned to support each other rather than compete. Thomas sat with other loyal servants who had discovered that true loyalty meant encouraging growth rather than enforcing stagnation. Even Evangeline appeared, though transformed beyond recognition, no longer the obsessed heroine, but a gentle counselor who helped others recognize the difference between love and possession. Is this real? Sarah asked, overwhelmed by the sight of so many narratives coexisting in harmony. Or are we just in another story with different rules? Margaret considered the question as they found seats at a table where new arrivals were always welcome. Around them, conversations flowed in dozens of languages from countless genres, the formal speech of Victorian romance mixing with the crisp dialogue of space opera, the lyrical cadences of fantasy blending with the sharp wit of contemporary comedy. I think, Margaret said finally, that the difference between real and story isn't as important as we used to believe. What matters is whether we have the freedom to grow, to choose, to become more than we were yesterday. As if summoned by her words, the warm presence that had once been Caleb Harrison settled around their table like a blessing. Sarah gasped softly as she felt it not intrusive or overwhelming, but supportive in the way that good soil supports. Growing plants, providing nourishment without demanding anything in return. That's him, isn't it? Sarah whispered. The one who sacrificed himself to create this place. Transformed himself, Margaret corrected gently. He chose to become something larger so that all of us could become something more. Here, still part of every story, still growing along with the rest of us. The evening meal continued around them, but Margaret found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. A year ago, she had been the spinster companion, the supporting character whose job was to facilitate other people's romances while never expecting one of her own. Now she was, the caretaker of stories, the guardian of choice, who helped others discover their own agency. All of those things, perhaps? But also simply Margaret went as a woman who had learned that the most important story she could tell was the one she wrote fresh each day through her choices, her relationships, her commitment to helping others find their own freedom. As the evening wound down and the various characters began to disperse to their chosen activities, some to the library to read stories that had never tried to trap them, others to the workshops, where they could experiment with new roles and possibilities, still others to the gardens where they could help new narratives. Margaret felt a deep contentment settle over her. This was what happiness looked like when it wasn't scripted, when it arose naturally from authentic choices rather than predetermined plot points. This was what love looked like when it was freely given and freely received, when it created space for growth rather than demanding possession. Sarah stayed close as they walked through the manor's corridors, marveling at rooms that reshaped themselves to meet the needs of their occupants, at libraries that contained every story that had ever been told and space for every story that had yet to be written. "What will you do tomorrow?" Margaret asked as they reached the guest quarters where Sarah would spend her first night as a fully autonomous being. "I don't know," Sarah replied, and for the first time, uncertainty sounded like possibility rather than anxiety. "I thought I might explore the workshops, maybe try writing something myself. Perhaps I'll help in the gardens. See what new stories are trying to grow. The choice is mine, isn't it?" "Every day," Margaret confirmed. "Every moment, if you want it to be." As Sarah's door closed behind her, Margaret made her way to her own room, a space that had evolved over the months to reflect her growing understanding of herself. Books lined the walls, but so did windows that looked out onto infinite possibilities. A writing desk stood ready for the stories she might choose to tell, while comfortable chairs invited contemplation and rest. She settled by the window that looked out over the gardens, where stories grew like living things, their various genres creating a tapestry of narrative possibilities that shifted and changed with each passing moment. In the distance, she could see the workshops where characters experimented with new roles, the meeting halls where former enemies learned to collaborate, the quiet spaces where those overwhelmed by choice could rest until they were ready to choose again. And threading through it all, invisible but unmistakable, the gentle presence that had once been Caleb Harrison, no longer a person in the traditional sense, but the foundation that made all of this freedom possible. He had kept his promise, in the most profound way imaginable, by loving everyone enough to let them go, to let them become whatever they chose to become, to hold space for infinite stories without demanding to be the hero of any single one. Margaret opened a journal she had never bothered to keep during her previous life as a supporting character. On the first page, she wrote, "Day 183 since the transformation. Today I helped a half-written character become fully real through the simple act of choosing honey over sugar. Tomorrow, I will help others discover their own capacity for choice. This is my story now, not because it was predetermined, but because I write it fresh each day. In the space between all our stories, love continues to create room for every possible ending." She closed the journal and settled back to watch the stars appear in a sky that had learned to reflect the collective dreams of all the beings below. Each light represented a story freely chosen, a character who had stepped beyond their original limitations. A narrative that grew through choice rather than inevitability. It was, Margaret reflected, the most beautiful ending she could have. Imagined not because it was perfect, but because it was free. Not because everything was resolved, but because everything was possible. And tomorrow, like every day in this new story, would begin with infinite choices waiting to be made. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up.
Oh.
Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.